Nutrient Cycles Part 1 examines the cycling of matter within an ecosystem as the molecules are transformed from the inorganic to the organic and back. Remember, energy enters, flows through, and exits the biosphere, but matter continuously cycles within the ecosystem. Significant ideas are: ecosystems are linked together by energy and matter flows. The sun's energy drives these flows, and humans are impacting the flows of energy and matter both locally and globally. Here's an image you've seen before: the Earth as a closed system. Light, high-quality energy, enters the system, is transformed into chemical energy by photosynthesis, flows through the system as chemical energy as the energy moves through the food webs, and leaves the system as heat, a low-quality energy form. Matter, on the other hand, cycles. Chemical elements and compounds cycle among living organisms and the physical environment. Here are the relevant IB syllabus statements. Describe the processes involving the transfer and transformation of carbon, nitrogen, and water as they cycle within an ecosystem, and note the conversion of organic and inorganic storage where appropriate. Construct and analyze flow diagrams of these cycles. The generalized model for a biogeochemical cycle is given here. You can see the movement of chemical elements and compounds between living organisms and the physical environment here, and the flows are relatively fast because these flows involve the living organisms. You can also see the movement of chemical elements and compounds into and out of the lithosphere, the rigid outermost shell of the Earth. The movement of chemical elements and compounds into and out of material located at depth below the surface of the Earth is very slow. Here is another image of the generalized biogeochemical cycle. This is an important image to study. The geo, or rock, portion of the cycle is here on the right, and you can see the movement of material into and out of the Earth. On the left, we can see molecules cycling back and forth between living organisms and the physical environment. You should get to know the processes stated here. Some should be familiar to you, such as erosion, or photosynthesis, or respiration. You need to study this diagram to make sense of the relationships among the stalks and the flows. For example, respiration releases carbon dioxide to the air from the organic to the inorganic, represented by this flow. Photosynthesis results in the uptake of carbon dioxide by plants from the atmosphere, represented by this flow. Assimilation refers to the uptake of nitrogen from the inorganic to the organic by plants or phytoplankton from the soil or water, respectively. Decomposition, represented by this arrow, should make sense to you from our previous work. Erosion should be familiar to you. Fossilization is the process by which organic matter is stored as fossil fuel, still organic matter, deep within the Earth. The formation of sedimentary rock should be obvious to you. This flow is sometimes known as sedimentation or deposition. You need to know all of the terms associated with the flows that you can see here. The carbon cycle is shown here. We are strictly looking at the cycling of carbon from the inorganic to the organic through photosynthesis, from the organic to the inorganic through respiration, and from the organic fossil fuel to the inorganic carbon dioxide. We can see the flow of carbon from producer to primary consumer to secondary consumer, and ultimately every organism respires carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. We can see decomposition here, the breakdown of large organic carbon-based molecules to the inorganic carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And in this image, we see something not seen previously in the generalized models. We see the combustion of organic fossil fuel to the atmosphere as inorganic carbon dioxide. In this image of the carbon cycle, we can see the cycling of carbon as we did in the last slide, but I've added energy flowing into the system, through the system, and out of the system in a less ordered form. Remember that whenever energy is transformed, some of it proceeds to a less ordered form, heat. This is the second law of thermodynamics. Here's an image that is worthwhile studying because it provides information on the magnitude of the stocks and the flows in the units given here. I've color-coded transfers in blue and transformations in red. Notice that the flows are rates, while the stocks are not. Moles represents a number of atoms that could be converted to mass units as necessary. Notice that the amount of carbon in sediments and fossil fuels are quite large. The amount of carbon in the atmosphere and in plants are quite large relative to the other stocks that are here, except for the carbon in sediments and the carbon in fossil fuels. Notice the fast flows are those that are in and out of living organisms, while the flows in and out of rock and fossil fuel are quite slow. The flows here and here are mining and combustion, respectively. As you look at models such as those that I've given you here, it's important that you think of stocks as stocks of carbon or energy or biomass. Avoid stating that stocks are trees. Tune into the appropriate language use and avoid generalities. The rock portion of the cycle, or the stocks of carbon deep within the earth, are missing from this diagram. Here is another image showing the magnitude of stocks and flows. Notice the units. Flows are given as rates. Can you find the combustion flow? Notice the flows of carbon dioxide into and out of the ocean. Carbon dioxide will dissolve in the ocean, and it might be interesting to note that the temperature of the water affects solubility. Consider this in light of climate change. Also notice that deforestation and land use patterns add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Notice the presence of fossil fuels, a storage of carbon due to the transformation of carbon into the fossil fuel known as fossilization. By IB syllabus demand, these are the flows in the carbon cycle with which you need to be familiar. T2 flows are transformation, T1 flows are transfers. You need to know photosynthesis, respiration, consumption, assimilation, excretion, death, decomposition, dissolving, and fossilization. Here's another simple image of the carbon cycle. Notice the lithospheric stock here, limestone. Notice the deposition, sedimentation of inorganic carbon at the bottom of the ocean into limestone. Notice the carbon storage in the ocean itself. Carbon dioxide dissolves in water. And remember that the phytoplankton take up carbon dioxide through photosynthesis as the base of the aquatic food web. Fossil fuels form over geologic time due to fossilization, which is a transformation. As a last note, before moving to the nitrogen cycle, it's important to say that oxygen for respiration is not always available. Thus, when oxygen is not available, the condition is called anaerobic, and it occurs in the guts of cattle and in rice paddies and deep within the soil. My interest is not that you understand the chemical details of anaerobic respiration, but that I want you to know that it does occur, and when it does, methane gas is the product. In other words, notice that farming produces methane. Methane is a greenhouse gas. Humans impact the carbon cycle by burning fossil fuels. From the deep earth, fossil fuels are mined, then burned. Atmospheric carbon dioxide is increasing, and dissolved carbon dioxide in the oceans is increasing. Human activities interfere with the carbon cycle within specific ecosystems. Deforestation results in fewer trees taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Thus, carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere increase. As well, carbon is removed from the system as the timber is exported or leaves the system. Burning the forest adds more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Human activities interfere with the carbon cycle within specific ecosystems. Humans consume half of the world's net primary production. One species consumes half of all available food on Earth. As well, industrial agriculture is dependent on fossil fuel combustion, thus increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. To farm the land, the natural ecosystem is removed. Early succession species have high rates of productivity. Food, carbon is moved around the world, altering local carbon cycles. Rice paddies release methane, a carbon-based molecule involved in climate change. And now we move to the nitrogen cycle. In this image of the nitrogen cycle, I've started with the most sterile of model diagrams in an attempt to simplify the cycle for you. Stay focused. Remember, the red flows are transformations and the blue flows are transfers. We have a storage of atmospheric nitrogen here. We have the storages and flows of nitrogen into and through the living organisms here, back to the soil. The organic nitrogen is in the living organisms, while the inorganic is found in the soil and in the atmosphere. The plants and the animals do not get nitrogen from the atmosphere. Notice that there are no flows here. Nitrogen is taken up by plants from the soil because this soil layer has the decomposers and the bacteria that fix nitrogen from the atmosphere and make it available to the plants. Let me point out a couple of important things. There is no interaction of plants and animals with atmospheric nitrogen. Nitrogen arrives into food webs when plants take it up, take nitrogen from the soil. Notice the simple cycle seen here. Producers absorb nitrogen from the soil. This is absorption. Producers assimilate that nitrogen into plant organic matter. Nitrogen moves to consumers by consumption, feeding, and decomposers return nitrogen to the soil when plants and animals die. Bacteria make nitrogen available to the soil through a transformation process known as nitrogen fixation, seen here. This is important to know. Bacteria, often associated with the roots of pea family plants, will remove nitrogen from the air and make it available to the soil in a form that's known as ammonium. Then this is likely to be converted to nitrites and nitrates. Plants absorb nitrates and ammonium. These are transfers. They absorb them, transfers, and then assimilate the nitrogen into protein. That's a transformation. Bacteria, particularly in water-logged soils, will return nitrogen to the atmosphere in a process known as denitrification. This model of the nitrogen cycle does not include any of the sedimentary cycle for nitrogen. Nitrogen is stored deep in the earth and rock, and just a bit of nitrogen in fossil fuels. In this image, we can see the nitrogen cycle with a bit more realism. It has all of the components seen in the last slide, but let me add a couple of thoughts. Notice how the fertilizers contribute to the nitrates in the soil. Fertilizers are most often industrially produced. Fertilizers represent an intersection of humans and a nutrient cycle. Notice that lightning will fix nitrogen from the air into nitrates in the soil. This is a form of nitrogen fixation. The important storages are the living organisms. These are our organic storages. We also have atmospheric nitrogen, an inorganic storage. And the inorganic soil nitrogen arises from decomposers and bacteria that fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. In aquatic systems, nitrogen molecules would be dissolved in the water. In this image of the nitrogen cycle, I've added the magnitude of the storages, and I've added the lithospheric portion of the cycle, seen right here. Some nitrogen is stored in rock and fossil fuel. Notice the magnitude of the atmospheric stock of nitrogen. Now this should make sense to you because nitrogen gas makes up nearly 80% of the Earth's atmosphere. The atmospheric stock is larger than the stock found in the Earth's sediments. Industrial fixation is meant to be the application of industrially produced fertilizers to the soil by our agricultural practices. Now, theoretically, nitrogen fixation and denitrification should be in equilibrium, but with the addition of industrially produced fertilizers, soil nitrogen levels are increasing. This is causing pollution, especially in our waterways. This is where humans interfere with the nitrogen cycle. The IB syllabus asks that you know the following flows: transformations T2, transfers T1. You need to know nitrogen fixation, absorption by plants, assimilation into protein by plants, consumption, feeding by consumers, assimilation by consumers, excretion, death, decomposition, and denitrification. In this image of the nitrogen cycle, there are three things that I would like to point out. We can see the runoff and the leaching of soil nitrogen into the waters of the world. This results in eutrophication. We'll be studying eutrophication as a pollution problem later in this course. Remember that aquatic systems are also storages of nitrogen. We can see that N2O is also released to the atmosphere. N2O is a greenhouse gas known as nitrous oxide, and the use of fertilizers is increasing the release of N2O to the atmosphere. And transforming nitrites to nitrates is a process known as nitrification. I've not identified nitrification processes in previous slides. Here's one last slide of the nitrogen cycle. Everything included on this slide should be familiar to you, having been introduced on the previous slides. Take time to study this image. Human activities interfere with the nitrogen cycle. Agriculture employs nitrogen compounds as fertilizers to stimulate productivity. In excess, fertilizers are pollutants. Human activities interfere with the nitrogen cycle. Agriculture, harvesting plants, removes nitrogen from the system and transfers it to other locations. Human activities interfere with the nitrogen cycle. Deforestation, harvesting trees, removes nitrogen from the system and transfers it to other locations. The combustion of fossil fuels adds nitrogen to the atmosphere. And as a last look, a different look at nutrient cycling, let's examine Gershmiel diagrams of nutrient cycling in ecosystems. Here is a generalized Gershmiel diagram. The storages are shown as circles, and their relative size displays the relative magnitude of each storage. The flows are shown as arrows, and their relative size indicates the magnitude of the flow. The storage of nutrients in soil would be inorganic nutrients, primarily nitrogen, but also water. Just as a note here, this storage does not represent carbon available to plants. Plants take up their carbon from the air in the form of carbon dioxide. The storage of nutrients in the litter would be organic matter in or on the soil, including leaf litter and humus. Humus is partially decomposed organic matter. The storage of nutrients in biomass is the total dry mass of living organisms, plants mostly, per unit area. Nutrient inputs into ecosystems include nutrients dissolved in raindrops and nutrients from weathered rocks. Remember carbon, as carbon dioxide comes into the living system through photosynthesis. Nutrient outputs from ecosystems include nutrients lost through surface runoff and nutrients lost through leaching. Remember carbon, as carbon dioxide leaves the system through respiration. Within the system, nutrients cycle from biomass to the surface of the soil, known as litter, decomposition from litter to soil, and the uptake of nutrients by plants from the soil. Don't forget that carbon comes and goes due to photosynthesis and respiration. The movement of carbon is not represented well by Gershmiel diagrams. To strengthen your grasp of Gershmiel nutrient cycling diagrams, let me compare Gershmiel diagrams in rainforest and desert biomes. In a rainforest, most of the nutrients are locked up in the tissues of big trees that hold those nutrients for many, many years. Thus, the biomass component of a Gershmiel diagram for a rainforest is large. Any leaf litter on the forest floor is rapidly decomposed, so there is very little litter on the floor. Then the litter component of the Gershmiel diagram would be very small. And as nutrients become locked up in the tall trees, there is very little nutrition in the soil. Again, the soil component of a Gershmiel diagram for a rainforest is also small. You can see the huge biomass storage of the rainforest here. In rainforest, litter decomposes quickly, and nutrients are rapidly taken up by the vegetation. Thus, in rainforests, the soil is quite nutrient poor. Thus, in Gershmiel diagrams of rainforests, the biomass storage is large, while the litter and soil storages are small. In a desert, most of the nutrients reside in the soil. Let's take a look. In a desert, most of the nutrients would be in the soil because there is sparse vegetation and, as a direct result of that, very little leaf litter. Due to low rainfall, a significant limiting factor, the biomass in the desert is small. Thus, the litter is small. So nutrients would be found in relatively high abundance in the soil, but due to low plant productivity, there they remain. And that brings us to the end of Nutrient Cycles Part 1. In Part 2, we will examine the hydrological cycle, the water cycle.